Hello, my name is Carol Golly, and I'm very happy to be with you all today on Grandparents' Day of 2022. And I'd like to thank Elaine Cobb and Family Access for hosting my talk today. And the title is Grandparents' Day: Reflections, Strategies, and Hope for Alienated Grandparents when the day is not grand. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about Grandparents' Day. The United States Congress passed legislation proclaiming the first Sunday after Labor Day as National Grandparents' Day in the United States in 1978. President Jimmy Carter signed the proclamation. And the purposes for Grandparents' Day is to honor grandparents, to give grandparents an opportunity to show their love to their children's children, and to help children become aware of the strength, information, and guidance older people can offer the grandchildren. And it really came about due to a grassroots movement, and one grandmother who pushed it for many years, and it took about 25 years, but finally is now recognized as official Grandparents' Day. And the proclamation for Grandparents' Day was written in 1979, and it's as follows. We all know grandparents whose values transcend passing fads and pressures, and who possess the wisdom of distilled pain and joy. Because they are usually free to love and guide and befriend the young without having to take daily responsibility for them, they can often reach out past pride and fear of failure and close the space between generations. So this is a little bit of an odd wording, but I think it really speaks to the value of grandparents being recognized for their wisdom and their ability to be free to love their grandchildren and not provide the daily in and out care, but provide other loving and supportive functions for their grandchildren. So there are about 70 million grandparents in the United States, and they are 1/3 of our population. And being a grandparent, we know, is very important to grandparents, because 72% report that being a grandparent is the single most important, satisfying thing in their lives, according to an AARP study. So the grandparents are highly significant to the health and well-being of grandchildren. They provide support, caregiving, mentorship, friendship. They can provide information about the family culture and history. And they can even help mediate difficulties in the family, such as trauma or other challenges for families. And we know that having an involved grandparent can even help increase the IQ for a grandchild. So grandparents provide very important functions for grandchildren. But what about when things go awry and being a grandparent is painful because you are prevented from seeing your grandchildren or cut off from your grandchildren? And, I noticed that in the proclamation for Grandparents' Day, one of the sentences says, because grandparents are usually free to love and guide and befriend the young. But back then we weren't, in 1979, we weren't seeing a lot of grandparent cutoff. It was not a common occurrence as it is today. Right now, it's estimated that 100 million grandparents throughout the world are prevented from seeing their grandchildren. So we do know that for many people, Grandparents' Day has the potential to be extremely painful. Knowing that this is a special day that where grandparents should be honored and grandchildren should be with their grandparents, or at least acknowledging them on Grandparents' Day. Many grandparents cannot have that experience. So how does this happen? How do parents become cut off from grandchildren? It could be a very sudden occurrence where one day grandparents just are told we can no longer see you, or they don't respond at all to the grandchildren's calls, texts, emails. It could be more gradual, where grandparents are slowly denied access. The access is more limited, and they can become cut off in a more gradual way. They also may experience accusations of things that are not accurate, be accused of things that they did. Like I know one of our grandparents that I had told me, well, I used the wrong kind of detergent when I was washing the children's clothes. My daughter-in-law said, you can never see them again, because if you don't use at least the right kind of detergent on them, that means you must not love them. So it can be these or accusations such as you're putting them to bed too late when they've slept over, or you're letting them get away with too much, or kind of these nitpicky type things that those things happen in families, but being cut off does generally not happen, and it's not normal. Most healthy families can work through those types of situations. And also grandparents can become denied access to children at their sporting events, school events, and church events, things like that grandparents become no longer allowed to attend. And other family members can be enlisted in the rejection, such as extended family of the rejecting family. Also, mail and gifts may be returned in the mail. So how does that happen? Can be the pathway or the situation when grandparents can be cut off? And what we know that one of the situations is when an adult child dies, and then maybe the surviving parent moves away, remarries, or just cuts the grandparents off because I don't know, how can you explain that? Except maybe that the surviving parent wants to move on and has a lot of grief. But I first heard about grandparent alienation by watching a video from Great Britain, where a son of a wonderful mother had unfortunately passed away in the Royal Navy. And this grandmother, Margaret, had been very involved with her granddaughter until the father died, when the granddaughter was about 6 years old. And after that, the mom moved away and really cut Margaret out. And it was just very tragic. There was many years later, Margaret was able to regain access to her granddaughter, which is when the granddaughter was a teenager. So that was a case of reunification, but she still missed all those years and went through a great deal of agony in the meantime. So also, grandparents may be cut off if their adult child is incarcerated, or there's a family feud or mental illness of the adult child. And because your adult child is generally and the spouse, if they are married, is generally the gatekeeper for the grandchildren, then access to grandchildren is quite dependent on the relationship with your adult child and their spouse. There could be mental illness of the adult child, or your adult child marries somebody or partners with somebody who has a mental illness, particularly a personality disorder that is associated with family cutoffs and relationship difficulties such as borderline personality, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder are three that are particularly noted for being extremely difficult to navigate for other family members. So also grandparents can be cut off as a result of parental alienation. And this is a condition in which a child allies strongly with one parent and rejects the other parent without justification. And it's very sad because then the parents of the rejected parent become collateral damage in that process and can be rejected also. And of course, we know there are times when grandparents can act inappropriately. And so we acknowledge that that can be something that happens at times also. So what are the effects on the grandparents? The effects can be physical and emotional, we know. The physical effects are things like related to stress disorders, such as high blood pressure, cardiac problems, migraine headaches, difficulty sleeping, those types of things where our bodies are on edge, and it's difficult to cope with those kinds of, the kind of pressure that is associated with being cut off. Also unending anxiety, because you never know if or when you might see your grandchild, or things might change, and you never know if your grandchildren is okay, your grandchild is okay, and what they're doing, and what's being said about you, and also what you might be accused of next. So it can really cause a lot of anxiety for grandparents in that regard. But particularly experience of loss can be strong. And there's a wonderful researcher named Pauline Boss from, she is now retired, professor from the University of Minnesota. And she studied what she later termed ambiguous loss. And this is when someone is present psychologically in your life, but not physically. And it's a different kind of loss than the grief that we think of normal grief as. When somebody dies, we know what their story is. We know the story of their death. We know where they're buried. We know where we can go to visit their body, or to think of them. Or perhaps if they're cremated, we can go to a special place and think of them. And memorials are very healing and helpful for human beings. So, but ambiguous loss is a very, very difficult type of loss to cope with, and it's not pathological. It's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So it's not a diagnosis, but it's Dr. Boss believes that it is the most difficult type of loss that we can experience. And how she discovered it was studying or working with the military to learn about families of prisoners of war and missing in action, and also people who have been kidnapped, and how people can cope with that kind of situation, and loss resulting from unexplained disappearance, like kidnapping, war, terrorism, deportation, and natural disasters. having a loss of contact. Also in divorce, there's a great deal of loss, according to Dr. Boss, that is ambiguous in nature, because you go on having a relationship generally with the person, but they're no longer present in your home. And it's a very different relationship when you're co-parenting with someone rather than when you're married to them. So Dr. Boss said it's a type of what is known also as complicated grief. And complicated grief has now reached, kind of morphed into a diagnosis in the psychological world called prolonged grief disorder. And this was, I think it was approved for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is called the DSM for short, this year. And so prolonged grief disorder involves having trouble coping for a year or more, and then people can be diagnosed with that. However, ambiguous grief can go on for many years, and that is not abnormal. And it doesn't mean that the person experiencing it has any psychopathology. So we can talk a little bit more about coping with that too. One of the most important things Dr. Boss says for coping with ambiguous grief is to hold two opposing thoughts in your mind at the same time, because it's not really helpful if people say, well, things will get better, or well, at least you had a few years with your grandchildren, or someday they'll probably come around, because nobody knows if that's true. So it's really feels ingenuous in a way. And people mean it to be kind. They're not trying to be unkind, but Dr. Boss says it's more helpful for people experiencing ambiguous loss to say two things that are true, such as I'm cut out from my grandchild, but maybe that will end someday. Or I'm not allowed to see my grandchildren, but I'm still a really good person and I can get through this. So that can be a more helpful type of thinking. And how the relationship to grandparents for ambiguous loss is, the child is not physically present, but present in the heart and mind of the grandparent, because there is always a connection of the heart that grandparents have with their grandchildren, particularly if they have spent a great deal of time with their grandchildren. There's a lot of grandparents that have been very close to their grandchildren, or even provided regular care, and then suddenly cut off one day for no reason. And grandparents wonder, is there a continued hope for reunion? There's a sense of powerlessness, because maybe you've tried strategies, but haven't had success with that. And role confusion, am I still a grandparent, even though I don't see my grandchildren? And there can also be a lack of social support for being cut off as a grandparent, because it's very difficult for people to understand how that could happen. It's very counterintuitive, and then it's a lot of times it's very shameful for a alienated or cut off grandparent to talk about. They carry a lot of guilt and shame about it, and so it's difficult for them to let other people know. So it's kind of recognized as possibly being a form of silent suffering. So I had a recent personal experience with a near loss that gave me a better understanding of some of the challenges of ambiguous loss. I had taken a trip. I live in kind of northern central New York in the summer, and my husband and I had taken a trip to New York City to visit family, and we left our dog with our kind of longtime dog sitter who owns a 180-acre farm in central rural New York. And he had escaped quickly, suddenly, and ran across the road and was hit by a car. He's a little Cairn Terrier like Toto. And he ran off into the woods, and our friend was devastated, our dog walker. It wasn't her fault. We couldn't find him. He was gone. We came back from New York as soon as we could. We walked up and down the river nearby and every place we could. I studied websites of dog recoveries and found out the best thing that you can do is make posters and put them up and look for sightings, because then you know where to look and to put food out and that kind of thing. So I'll just show you a poster real quick. That's my Jackson. And so though I put those posters up, and my husband was very discouraged after 2 days, and he said, we're not going to find him. He just couldn't look anymore. So he went home, but I know he was very affected. And I just kind of followed what they said on the dog recovery site. And they said, never give up, never assume that your dog is missing, because they often can come back after months, years. And if you keep putting food out and do these certain kinds of things, that it could happen. But during that time, I found myself walking around my house thinking, well, you know, there's his bowl, there's his little sleeping bed, there's his dog food. You know, do I keep that? Is it going to make me too sad to look at it? Am I still a dog mother? You know, could I ever have another dog? This is my fault. I should have never gone to New York City. You know, all those things that we think in a loss, and really feeling ashamed that he could be out there somewhere suffering. Maybe he went off after being hit and died, or just not knowing where he was made me really on edge and anxious, and thinking there's a lot of coyotes out there. You know, we just think all these things. And so, you know, having that ambiguous grief and not knowing. And I thought, you know, this is really interesting because I'm working on, you know, thoughts about Grandparents' Day, and then this is happening. And in the midst of that, while in New York City, my husband and I were supposed to visit the 9/11 memorial, which is really, I think, significant. I've never been there, but it's very significant because Grandparents' Day falls on 9/11 this year. I think there's about 4 times since 1970. Well, I'm sorry, since 2001, when 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers were attacked and fell, that Grandparents' Day has fallen on 9/11 because it's the second Monday after Labor Day each year. So we were supposed to go to the memorial, and then we ended up, you know, looking for Jackson. But the memorial has significant for grandparents too, because a lot of the families of people who died in 9/11 suffered ambiguous loss. Their people just went to work and disappeared, and they could never be found, you know, and it was a very you know, ambiguous situation for them. And Pauline Boss worked with 9/11 families on ambiguous loss, and they felt shame and guilt too. And one of the survivors of 9/11, one of the families said, you know, I had set the alarm clock for my husband to get up a little bit later the next day because we had a new baby, and he worked in the Twin Tower, one of the Twin Towers. He would go in at 8 a.m. and come back at 9 because he was kind of a courier. So normally he was out by 9, but that day the alarm clock went off later. So he was killed. And the wife felt for years that it was her fault. And then one day she remembered that he had set the alarm clock later that day because he wanted to be with his wife and baby for an extra half hour before going to work. So there was, stories about quite a few that Dr. Boss had shared about the 9/11 family members. And I wondered if this is, how grandparents feel that are cut off also, because your person is gone and you don't really know where they are. So getting back to my little dog, and I realize you cannot compare loss of an animal to that of a human loved one. And so I respect that. But, we all just love our pets. And I know Elaine Cobb lost her beloved pet Guy this year too. And I was thinking of her. But long story short, after 5 days, I went down to the river and I was setting up some food, hoping Jackson would come and maybe eat a little. And there he was. I looked up the river and he was standing on top of a rock, just wagging his tail. He looked a little skinny and he came back and slept for 3 days. So and he seems fine. So I'm very thankful. But it made me think a lot about the grieving perhaps that grandparents experience in this kind of a situation of loss and not knowing is really the toughest kind of grief. So I'm sorry, I'm just. All right. So what about, just briefly, I'll talk about strategies of, if your goal is reunification, what are some strategies that you can use? And there is a lot of information available on this on the Family Access website. And you may have, heard this before, likely, but there are some, we can look to reunifications that have been noted by grandchildren reuniting with their grandparents. And so we've been able to learn from that. And one of the most important things is to really focus on your adult child, because they're the gatekeeper and they're usually, either they or their spouse are often the ones, well, almost always the ones that are initiating and maintaining the cutoff. So it's normal to feel angry and want to vent at them and let them know how much they've hurt you, but that's not helpful for reunification. So if you can get to a place through, healing, through whatever work that you need to do, so that you can have the approach that seems to work in these situations, to work best, is to be kind as you can to your adult child. And don't go back to the past. Just be in touch with them once or twice a month with an email or a text and say, I'm thinking of you. I hope you're well. I saw this funny thing today, or this little picture of a flower that they liked, or maybe an animal they liked, and just said, I was thinking of you and would love to have a cup of coffee sometime. And that's it. Something simple in that vein. And there are more suggestions like this, as I said, on the Family Access website. And then also, it's important not to be confrontational, demanding, defensive, or pushy. I worked with a lovely gentleman once in my private practice as a clinical social worker, who was working on reuniting with his son that he hadn't talked to in probably 5 years. And his son had married and had a granddaughter who my client had never met. And he really was, he would try hard, and he would say, he would be appropriate, but he would always get a dig in, like, blaming the wife, or, you've hurt me so much, or if you would stop being this, or, you'd stop this kind of awful behavior. And so that was really unhelpful. And he just couldn't get past doing that. So that was very frustrating for our work together, and sad for him. So he went on to do some more work with himself, and I've heard that he has at this point reunified. But so we don't want to be confrontational and pushy. We've had grandparents who sent cards and gifts for years, not knowing if they were ever received, and sometimes they found out, oh, my dad just threw them away, but oftentimes they found out they actually did get them. So sending these things through the mail, even though you never hear anything back, can be a really helpful strategy. Also using advocates. Are there any other friends or family members that can advocate for you, and call your rejecting adult child and say, I saw your mom the other day and she's just doing so well. And have you thought about getting together? And so advocates can be really helpful. And also, we talked about gifts, but also recognizing your adult child's birthdays, your grandchildren's birthdays, Christmas times. Also maintaining a memory box, which is, if you're not allowed to send cards, you can put them in a box and save everything. You can even journal. You could share a book with them from a wonderful man who, Reverend John Killinger, who has been involved with Family Access for many years. And he has several books he's written for his grandchildren. Letters from Poppy with Love. And they're just wonderful stories about things that he did as a young person, things that he would love to share, romps through the forest, traveling that he would love to share with his grandchildren. And he hopes that one day they will be able to read his books. And other parents have read these books and chosen to put them in a memory box. Also, I had a quote I wanted to give you. I can't find a particular quote, but it was from a man who we knew of, from a group of grandparents that I'm familiar with. And he said he had the memory box for many years and then never heard back from his grandson, but when the grandson was 18 years old and, legally independent, he just knocked at the door of his grandfather's house one day, and they talked. And he said, Grandpa, why didn't you ever try to get a hold of me? Why didn't you ever write to me? And his grandfather said, wait here. And he went and got the box, a very full box. And in it were all the cards, all of the letters that he'd written to his grandson. And his grandson spent hours reading through everything and just understood what happened and felt, very loved, and went on to have a really close relationship with his grandfather. And you just never know when that could happen. And that's why it's important to hang in there if you can. Facing rejection time after time is awful. And it's one of the hardest things that we can do, when we love other family members. But if you do, then it can work. And you just never know when that could work. So what about, I want to also mention, it's okay to take a break for a while too. And this can be incredibly painful and difficult. And it's okay if you need to stop and take a break from the stress of trying a lot and making efforts to reunite and having nothing come from it, and then coping with somebody who, makes accusations against you time after time that aren't true. It's okay to take a break from that for a while. It reminds me of when my husband had to stop looking for Jackson for a while because he just was so afraid, I think, of what we would find or not find. So sometimes we just need to step back and take that break, but not to give up, because your grandchildren would not want you to. And what grandchild does not want a grandparent in their lives? I've never ever heard of a grandchild say they don't want a grandparent in their life, unless they've been alienated, influenced in a cult of alienation, and convinced to believe things that are not true. But all grandchildren, I believe, want a relationship with their grandparents. So what about coping with cutoff emotionally? That's so difficult, as we were saying, and it can really cause the physical problems that we mentioned, and also the emotional challenge of depression. It can rob you of finding joy in the world because it's always kind of in the back of your mind. And every holiday, Mother's Day, birthday, and Grandparents' Day can be filled with sadness and feeling a sense of hopelessness. One grandparent described it by saying, this situation has made me clinically depressed, robbed me of seeing a future of enjoyment. Every holiday is filled with sadness and self-loathing because I feel useless. What kind of mother loses her child and grandchildren? So it's really important to realize that you did not cause this problem. You cannot change someone's behavior, but you can control how you respond to it. And changing the narrative in your heart, or really in your mind, is where it can really make a difference. For example, when we have those days we don't feel like getting out of bed, or just don't feel like connecting with the world, you can become aware of what your thinking is, like, I don't have anything to offer, or I'm no good, or this will never be okay. The negative thoughts, sometimes to write those down, acknowledge them, and then just work on taking some slow, deep breaths and let them go. Let those negative thoughts go as you exhale, and then replacing them with more true, accurate thinking. You have so much to offer. You are obviously capable of amazing things. To have this family, to have gotten to this age, that we had to solve a lot of problems to get to the age of being a grandparent. We had to be problem solvers and worthwhile human beings. So to replace that with, I've got this challenge, but I am getting through day by day. I am strong. I am getting there. I'm doing the best I can. This is not my fault. Those are the kinds of things that are more realistic and helpful thoughts that can really help us to find the energy to keep on going. And also, we know that finding something to say that you're grateful for every day can be really helpful against grief and depression. And sometimes that's really hard to do. We feel angry and hurt. But if you can find one thing to be grateful for, maybe it's I know the past week has been so hot. I feel like I'm grateful I have air conditioning, or things like I'm grateful I have my friend next door or a good neighbor who cares about me. I'm grateful that I can be outside, that I can walk for a ways, whatever it is that you can find that to be grateful for. It could be just one little thing each day or two that can really help us change our stress thinking in a very difficult period of time. Also, cultivating emotional resilience is difficult. It doesn't come without effort and an attitude of openness and really acceptance of ourselves. Resilience, we know, is something that comes from, facing problems, having some successes and some failures, and just getting up and trying each day. I did my doctorate I studied grandparents who were alienated from their grandchildren, and one of the things they said is that some days it's so very difficult to get up and have the energy to keep trying, and they can. But I had some people respond to the survey afterwards and saying, what I found was the rejection, whether it was sudden or gradual, still suffering from the pain. But as time went on, maybe they were, months or a few years out, that they could start functioning again pretty decently. And they described it as, in those first few months, for one lady, she said, those first 3 years, I didn't want to live anymore, but I wasn't actively suicidal. But I just didn't want to live. But once I took an hour at a time and a day at a time, and I got through to 3 or 4 years, I knew that I could get through it. I know that I could hold those two oppositional ideas in my head at the same time, that I don't see my grandchildren or my adult child, but I'm surviving, and she said she was able to have good groups of friends and get out and kind of re-engage with the world. And so what my survey suggested was, the longer the grandparents were cut off, the more, or I would say the less grief, the less depression, the less suicidal thinking they had. So, that is not conclusive by any means. We need a lot more understanding and research, but I think it's hopeful in some ways, because it shows that if you can get through it day by day, you can get to a point where you can live with it. You can live with this very difficult phenomenon, this situation. So, and Dr. Boss talked about that in her research, and she said there are about 2 to 3% of people that just can't. It's just too painful, and it just didn't really seem to get easier in her studies of ambiguous people experiencing ambiguous grief. So, what else can be helpful in supporting emotional resilience? Being kinder and gentler to yourself, not blaming yourself for the situation, and connecting with healthy others in your life. Just to be able to step back and give value to the relationships that you do have. Maybe it's I know during COVID, everybody was so shut in. And I have an elderly friend who said he really, couldn't get out. But one of the things he used to enjoy so much was walking down to the local little grocery store, because my friend doesn't drive anymore. And he used to be able to go down and talk to the longtime store owner and have relationships with people in that store. And during COVID, he said, I never realized how important the grocery store family is to me. So after COVID, he's made it a point to really connect again. And he said sometimes friendships that you have with people, you just, you don't realize how much they can really mean. So being able to reach out to other people, maybe it's through a support group, but maybe it's just through, people that you might see when you're out shopping or having other interests, or maybe volunteer work also. But that human connection, we know, is the most calming for our brains, and it's the most uplifting. It actually creates and supports cortisol. Oxytocin, which is a feel-good chemical that our brain releases when we meet with other people and talk to other people. It can also be produced when we see a sunset or we're out in nature. And so those kinds of things can be very helpful too, to be able to take walks. And exercising is very helpful. But when we're feel down, it's the last thing we feel like doing. It really is. But if we can get out there and get going for 15, 20 minutes walking, then things can feel a little different to us, and we can get a little more positive from the chemicals that are chemicals that are released in our brains and our bodies when we are engaging in those activities. Some alienated and cut off grandparents have found it very helpful to attend a support group. And there are support groups that regularly meet online throughout the United States and other countries. I know that the Family Access website has lots of support groups listed. And there is information that it's really hard to relate to people who haven't experienced this themselves. It's very difficult for other people to understand it. It's not the norm. Parental alienation and grandparent alienation is not the norm in society, and it really was pretty much unknown up until probably about 1960 or 70. It just wasn't really something that was much seen. So being with somebody who does understand it can be very helpful. And Ann Killinger, who was Reverend John Killinger's lovely wife that I mentioned earlier, what her comment was on support groups was, only other grandparents who are not allowed to spend time with their grandchildren have any conception of the unnatural stress that this places on our lives. So in my research study, 42% of cutoff grandparents said they found attending a support group somewhat helpful, and 36% found it very or extremely helpful. And a lot of, I think, attendees may attend for a little while, or some may go attend for a long time. And they're not for everybody. Some people do not enjoy the support groups, but they can be important for a lot of grandparents. Also, to rest, and which is hard because these types of traumas affect our ability to sleep, because they create cortisol in our bodies, which is the stress hormone, and which always keeps us on edge. And so sleeping can be very difficult, but we know how important it is to our physical and emotional well-being. Also, good nutrition is really important. If we can, try to eat protein throughout the day, it can help steady our blood sugar, which is really important when you're dealing with stress. Also, to make a plan for anniversary dates that can be very difficult. It could be something very simple, like just lighting a candle, or thinking of your loved one, or maybe making something special in their honor. Maybe it would be writing a note and putting it in a memory box, or putting it in the mail. But what would help you get through that day? Because most people are helped with ritual and tradition, and because it acknowledges our loss, it acknowledges it, and then it helps us kind of leave it there for a little while and go throughout the day, knowing that we've dedicated time and love to the activity that we had done. So that could be for Grandparents' Day, doing something. What would hold meaning for you for Grandparents' Day? I know this will be viewed, I believe, a few days before Grandparents' Day. So is there something that would be meaningful for you if you don't see your grandchildren? Or maybe you'd like to use that day to write them a card, and just, you don't know if they'll get it, but maybe they will. But it is, maybe to come up with something that you could do. Maybe it would be with other people, that you'll go out and do something with other people, and reach out, or reconnect with someone that you have been missing, that was an old friend, that type of thing, or visiting a neighbor. But whatever would hold meaning for you for Grandparents' Day. And really, it's about finding what works for you. I had a alienated parent say that working a 12-step program was very helpful for her, and she attended Al-Anon meetings, and found that this 12-step approach very helpful. But what she said is, it's not for everybody, and it's what she called it was finding your piece of the puzzle to get through this, and to keep hope alive. And this particular friend of mine did reunify with her son by using some of the techniques that we know can be helpful, and engaging in kind of a self-care plan through the period of, I think it was about 3 years that it took to get there. But I do know of about 300 reunifications, and some have been up to 20 years and then had reunification. So you just never know. But engaging in self-care is very important. So I guess the last kind of thing I wanted to say is that the official flower of Grandparents' Day is the forget-me-not, which is a beautiful blue spring flower. And I was looking at pictures of it, and I thought, that's such a calm looking flower. It's so, I love blue. It's kind of my color, and I find it very calming. And I thought, that is a beautiful flower for Grandparents' Day. I don't know if it's fragrant or not, but I'm going to see if I can find out more about it. But I was thinking of, all the alienated grandparents and grandparents who were not alienated, and how they're united in love for their grandchildren and have so much to offer them. And it's, represented by this beautiful flower and the Grandparents' Day. But just know that this is not your fault, and you have a lot to offer. And please feel free to keep in touch if you'd like. My email is very easy. It's CA, as in Carol Golly, GOLLY, at yahoo.com. And if you'd like to share an email, I will be back in touch with you. So thank you so much.